Hi, my name is Josh Clark. I am the debate coach at Montgomery Bell Academy, and today we will be discussing the Open Borders First Affirmative Constructive. So, if you're a debater or a coach, the hope behind this is that at the end of this short presentation, you'll know a little bit more about the Open Borders Affirmative to start the season. To start with an overview, the thesis of the open borders affirmative is that the intent is to allow the free flow of immigrants to come in and out of the country. There are a couple of different advantages to this that are cited in the file. The first one is one of morality. Um, this idea is that borders do not dictate the legality of individuals, that um, because you are born on one side of a border or another should not prevent you from trying to achieve the best life possible for you and your family. It's the idea is definitely founded in liberalism and the idea of individual rights being innate within each person who is born. So the free flow of immigration is supposed to be an intrinsic right, according to this advantage. And we'll get into more of that later. The advantage too is the economy. What's interesting is that on this topic, the global economy, many of the affirmative cases will claim that the some sort of economic nationalism, why the United States economy needs to be strong. What's different about this advantage is it's discussing the globalized economy and the flow of labor from place to place and the decrease overall in structural inequality and poverty due to more opportunity. We'll talk about the perspective this comes from, which is a libertarian perspective, the idea that nation states should have minimal role in international orders and instead rely on supply and demand to dictate markets. The idea here is that trillions are being lost because the different forms of labor are not allowed to migrate to areas where that labor is needed. Well, let's start with the plan. I think the plan's always a good place to start, even though in your file it's going to be after the first two advantages. It says that the United States should create a default presumption in favor of admission for legal immigration that requires strict scrutiny to override and eliminate existing cap and quotas for legal immigration. We will get into, in the solvency contention, what strict scrutiny means. However, what's important to note is that uh, the idea behind this is exactly the free flow of immigration um, without uh, without a form of um, bureaucracy that would prevent immigrants for coming in for what these authors would consider arbitrary reasons, either central planning, where the government is trying to take control and just assert how many immigrants are allowed into a country, or because of discrimination, because of relations with a certain country, or a nativist approach where it's the idea of not allowing other cultures into the country to preserve the culture of a country is rejected. Instead, the idea is that open borders allow for the free flow of people, with the only caveat being that um, there's a certain amount of security screening that would need to happen to prevent um, certain types of criminals or potential terrorists from entering the country. To give you a little background, let's discuss the current visa system and immigration quotas. The immigration, uh, the current visa system goes through a large amount of scrutiny to allow various people into the United States. These numbers are being drastically changed in the status quo as the amount of immigrants that are allowed in the country decreases substantially. From 150,000 employment visas to only allowing 50,000 refugees in the country when the 1980 Refugee Act was created, where 200,000 refugees were allowed, and in 1980, due to inflation of the world's population, it's a substantial less amount. The United States was once founded on this principle that the doors were open for all that were seeking a better life, and that is no longer the case, especially under the new Trump administration. Those immigration quotas continue to go down, and an anti-immigrant sentiment is used to try and garner political support for the upcoming midterm elections, and then, of course, the 2020 presidential election. So the first advantage that the affirmative will claim is one of morality. As you can see, Jeff Sessions is pictured in the slide. He has continued to instruct immigration judges to allow fewer and fewer people into the country, and they're using various means. Even this week, there was an instance where a judge ordered the Department of Justice to return two individuals who'd been deported before their immigration statuses could even be determined, because they were deported before that fact. So why could immigration be considered a moral right? The first evidence in this file, the Kukathis 05 evidence, discusses immigration restrictions are an inhumane denial of the opportunity to improve one's situation. Prima facie, they can't be justified. Let's first take into account prima facie, because both the tag and the piece of evidence there discuss it. Prima facie is a Latin for at first look or in its face. The legal definition is referring to a lawsuit or criminal prosecution in which the evidence before trial is sufficient to prove the case unless there is substantial contradictory evidence presented at trial. A prima facie case presented to a grand jury by the prosecution will result in an indictment. Example, in a charge of a bad check writing, evidence of a half a dozen checks written on a non-existent bank account makes it a prima facie case. However, proof that the bank had misprinted the account number on the checks might disprove the prosecution's apparent open and shut case. So prima facie is meant to say that it is an obvious right, that it rises above challenge, and that it's something so innate within a realm that it can't be, other issues can't come first. And so when we discuss prima facie, one of the ways that you could utilize this piece of evidence is to discuss the morality of the case as a prior question, meaning that questions of disadvantages, things like that, the disadvantages and other negative arguments can't rise to the level of probability in relation to the prima facie morality that exists of the case. And that morality is that the free flow of immigration, the attempt to earn a better life for you, your family, and loved ones, is something that should be innate and open to everyone. Right now, I wanted to discuss the morality claims of the affirmative. One of the claims that it makes is an indict of the ethical system of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is thought of as the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and I thought that we could watch this short video that kind of explains that thought, and then we'll watch another that provides a counter way of approaching other than utilitarianism.
Hi, I'm Julia Markovits, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at MIT. Today, I'm going to talk about utilitarianism. So I spend my time thinking about morality, about what makes actions morally right or morally wrong, and I wanted to talk today about a very simple, quite popular answer to that question, a moral theory that goes by the name utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has a lot going for it, but it also raises some very interesting worries, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of those. So utilitarianism is the view that actions are morally permissible if and only if they produce at least as much net happiness as any other available action. In other words, the more happiness and less suffering that results from our actions, the better the action is. And the right action is the one that produces the greatest balance of happiness over suffering. In fact, according to utilitarianism, any other action is morally wrong. This utilitarian principle is supposed to be absolute and all-encompassing. It will tell you for any decision whatsoever exactly what you should morally do, and it admits of no exceptions. Utilitarianism has been around for a long time, but it gained a lot in prominence and popularity in the late 18th century, due in part to the work of a British philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham published a long defense of utilitarianism called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation in 1789, but he was also a very politically and socially active guy. In fact, he was an early defender of economic liberalization, freedom of expression, the separation of church and state, women's rights, animal rights, the right to divorce, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of capital punishment, the abolition of corporal punishment, prison reform, and even the decriminalization of homosexual acts. Remember, this was 1789. Bentham recognized the moral importance of these rights, many of which are now uncontroversial. In this, he was well ahead of his time, and in large part, I would think, because of his embrace of utilitarianism. That, for me, counts heavily in favor of it as a moral theory. And in fact, aspects of utilitarianism can look very hard to resist. We can break the utilitarian thesis up into two parts: a theory of what is valuable and a theory of right action, given what's valuable. First, the theory of what's valuable. It says that the only thing that's valuable in its own right is happiness and the absence of suffering. Other things, like money, might be derivatively valuable because it helps us get happiness. Second, the theory of right action. The right action is the one that maximizes, produces the most of what's valuable, or if that's uncertain, that produces the most expected value. If you put those two pieces, the theory of what's valuable and the theory of right action given what's valuable, together, you get utilitarianism. Here's a very simple example. Let's say I'm a doctor and I have only 5 doses left of some very scarce medicine. In an emergency situation, I'm left with 6 patients, all of whom need the drug to survive. But one of them, let's call her needy, will survive only if I give her all 5 doses of the drug. The other 5 patients can survive on a single dose each, and we can assume that I know nothing else about these patients. Utilitarianism will tell us to divide up the drug, saving the 5 and allowing needy to die. Why? Because saving the 5 lives preserves much more happiness and prevents much more suffering than saving just 1 life. And in that case, that seems like the right answer. It's important to notice that these two elements of utilitarianism can be separated. We can accept the utilitarian view of what's valuable without embracing its claim about what that means for how we should act. And we can accept the utilitarian claim that the right action is the one that makes the most value without accepting the claim that happiness and the absence of suffering are all that's valuable.
So the idea behind utilitarianism is the maximization of good for the greatest number of people. Now, this might seem as an ethical matter, but what can happen is it can also cause majoritarian politics. Majoritarian politics mean what's good for the majority takes precedent over what's good for the minority. And in that instance, it can be used to justify things like structural violence. It can be used to justify poverty. It can be used to justify other forms of inequality and subjugation of minority populations as well as lower socioeconomic populations. For that reason, utilitarianism can't always be viewed as something that is intrinsically good or uh, an idea that should be universally accepted. And what this advantage does is it challenges that idea of utilitarianism, that as the video put, that the moral good is saving as many lives as possible, and the affirmative and the negative to the case can do this by providing disadvantages. The two disadvantages to this case are an overpopulation disadvantage that says the United States as a geographical area is environmentally in danger, and that only by continued decrease in the population can we hope to save the environment, which will preserve the existing population. So the idea is that if we have an influx of a lot more people, that will try the environment, and the environment will collapse. Necessary biodiversity will be interrupted, the food cycle, etc., and the environment will, means that it will no longer be able to sustain human life. So juxtapose that disadvantage to the affirmative that says, it's immoral. We cannot disallow immigrants from coming into the country. There is no intrinsic value to nativism that makes one person better than another just because they were born on the different side of a border. That is immoral, and that should be at the forefront of our moral concerns, as opposed to something that might seem a little bit more unlikely, that immigration could possibly cause environmental degradation, or the other disadvantage is wages, that it would bring down wages. So the idea of comparing wages or environmental concern for more populations when we're violating the very fundamental rights of individuals to seek a better life, we need to take into account that moral claim prior to the consequentialist claim, in this instance the utilitarian claim of the disadvantages. Before we do anything else, prima facie, we need to judge what is moral and move in that direction. The counter to utilitarianism is not deontology is not necessarily the ethic that the affirmative attributes, but it is consistent that we should ignore consequences to do what is right in some instances. The affirmative is not deontological to say in every instance we should just do what is right and ignore the consequences, but in this instance it should be so clear that the right to immigration is innate and part of our right to the pursuit of happiness, that everyone should be endowed with that right. We'll watch this short clip about deontology now.
Deontology. Deontology is an ethical theory that uses rules to distinguish right from wrong. It is often associated with philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that ethical actions follow universal moral laws, such as don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. Deontology is simple to apply. It just requires that people follow the rules and do their duty. This approach tends to fit well with our natural intuition about what is or isn't ethical. Unlike consequentialism, which judges actions by their results, deontology doesn't require weighing the costs and benefits of a situation. This avoids subjectivity and uncertainty because you only have to follow set rules. Despite its strengths, rigidly following deontology can produce results that many people find unacceptable. For example, suppose you're a software engineer, and learn that a nuclear missile is about to launch that might start a war. You can hack the network and cancel the launch, but it's against your professional code of ethics to break into any software system without permission. And it's a form of lying and cheating. Deontology advises not to violate these rules. However, in letting the missile launch, thousands of people will die. So, following the rules makes deontology easy to apply. But it also means disregarding the possible consequences of our actions when determining what is right and what is wrong.
So the example that the video uses is one that indicts this idea of that morality should come first, that we should, obey consequences because, hacking might be wrong, but if we're hacking to stop a nuclear attack, then that could be something that is beneficial. In this instance, that criticism wouldn't apply because of the magnitude of the moral claim versus the likelihood of the disadvantages. If the moralistic claim is that the United States should make a claim to open its borders to allow for the free flow of migration because it is intrinsic to what the country's system of morals stands for, that every human is endowed with this idea of with the innate right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that pursuit of happiness, intrinsic within that can't be separated from that, is that ability to immigrate to a place that can earn a better life. So the idea is that we should ignore the consequences of this morality advantage, is that we should ignore it because of the magnitude of the moral claim, and that other political disadvantages should be ignored because of how terrible this type of restriction is, and the amount of inequality and structural violence that it commits worldwide. The U.S. should set a signal to all that borders should be open. And that is the thesis of the first advantage. Now we'll move to the thesis of the second advantage, and that is the global economy. Before we talk about the specifics of the advantage, it's important to note the political perspective that this advantage takes. I mentioned in the introduction that a lot of the cases on this topic that deal with employment visas have the American economy as at its forefront. A lot of them discuss slow growth, that the United States is only slowly growing right now, and that we need an influx of immigrant labor in order to grow quicker and to help our companies mature faster. This advantage is distinct from that. It doesn't take a position of economic nationalism or the American economy, although it would definitely claim that it would help the American economy. Instead, it focuses on the global economy. The reason it does so is because of the political philosophy that that educates or informs that advantage, and that is of libertarianism. Many of the cards are written from the perspective of think tanks or researchers that specialize from this political philosophy. Those of you who are not familiar with libertarianism, libertarianism is an economically conservative and socially liberal philosophy that says that the government should remain small and leave the dealings of capitalism to capitalism, that we should rely on Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand and the free market to guide the economy, and that supply and demand should dictate prices as well as labor. And so that is the perspective here, and really that could also underlie the liberalistic values of the first advantage as well, that see, that pursuit of happiness, or that pursuit of property, as John Locke would say, is, that 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 moral right that we discussed prior. I've provided. You're welcome to stop the recording now and learn a little bit more about libertarianism from the definition below. But that is the political philosophy that's informing it. So the first thing that this advantage will say is that a recession is coming. Okay. The risk of a global recession is high, that there are structural factors that make current growth unsustainable. One of those is the slowing population growth in a lot of developed nations, including the United States. A lot of that is the the type of protectionism that is happening now under the Trump administration with trade wars. And what this evidence claims is a global consensus, or excuse me, a large consensus of economists that agree that this recession is upon us, that this level of rapid growth that we've come in the last couple of years is not something that will be sustained. The Eaton is talks about immigration as one of the, or if not the best way to prevent the economy from going into this recession. And it discusses the type of nativism that is happening now, and I've used that word a lot in this. And if you're not familiar with this idea, it's one that beckons to a value of individuals who are currently residing and currently have some sort of roots within a land, and a lot of time it informs nationalism. The idea behind nationalism is same place, or same people, same land, where a form of usually majoritarian politics is used to prevent minority populations from gaining influence or growing in population size, thereby threatening their majoritarian status. There's a lot of nativism that we're seeing currently in Europe and in the United States, and this piece of evidence says that the effects of that, the fact that borders are being closed, that the immigration cap is being cut in half, that refugees are down, over 50%, is the equivalent of leaving, for the globe, is the equivalent of leaving trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk. It says that economists estimate that allowing migrants to move to any country they choose would increase the global gross domestic product. For those of you not familiar with that economics term, it is the what each nation is able to, or the globe in this instance, is able to generate in terms of output. It says that this output would increase by between 67 and 147% by allowing this free flow of immigration. It says a doubling of the GDP, or the gross domestic product, would correspond to 23 years of growth at 3%. So it would be a giant boom to the global economy by allowing various workers to be able to fulfill the needs of different jobs in different countries, allowing for that free flow, as opposed to these historically drawn borders that by libertarian standards are completely arbitrary. If we're looking at a globalized world with globalized free capital flow, then these nation states that would like to keep money within that country and draw borders and create laws that protect that free flow of money and that free flow of labor are hindering the world's ability to gain trillions of dollars. So if that is hurting the economy and we're doomed for a recession, what could possibly be the impacts to that? So if we're allowed to go into this recession, one of the impacts that it discusses is poverty. That because immigration is not allowed to go, it dooms people's plight for a better life. And if they're not allowed to immigrate, it the evidence um, in the advantage says that there is no other concern with poverty that is so substantial as the inability to go where better jobs are and to where you can possibly make more money. It says that that leads to a form of socioeconomic oppression, or forced poverty that guarantees structural forms of violence, in environmental racism, and basically forcing people to live where they were born for no other reason than preserving some arbitrary idea of a nation state. Beyond that, there is a nuclear war claim, and for those of you who are new to debate, in debate we discuss nuclear war quite often. The idea to why a global recession could cause nuclear war is that one of the things that prevents us from being in war are our global trade networks. If those break down, and instead of searching for mutual growth, we're competing for resources, that can break down the relationships to various countries that can incite violence. And if it's in a country's necessity to feed its people to incite war, then that happens much more likely in a global recession than otherwise. And of course, you can cite the Great Depression and resulting World War II as a prime example of that happening. Of course, now with several more nuclearized states, nuclear bombs could be something that could be in it. The piece of evidence in the file cites, the theft of weapons of mass destruction that could help destabilize and break that nuclear taboo that could result in our great powers using the nuclear weapons that they have in the event that the economy collapses. So the solvency contention discusses how it could be fixed. This Dalmia evidence says that the plan is really loose borders. So we call it the Open Borders Act. That doesn't necessarily mean that anyone can come in. But the presumption for admission recalibrates government management as hands-off and allowing market correction. So what the government would allow is that the market to dictate how many immigrants should come into a country, as opposed to central planning and other arbitrary caps on immigration. So if more workers are needed, more workers are allowed inside of the country. And the strict scrutiny, and the presumption is for liberty. So if all things are considered, the nation state should always err on the side of liberty, and that is to allow immigrants into the country who are seeking that better life and better job. The strict scrutiny aspect of it says that it ought to have to meet a strict scrutiny standard. It must show that it has compelling state interest and that there is no other way of accomplishing that interest but barring that individual. So in that instance, we're talking about terrible forms of criminals and potential terrorists as as a threat to national security as opposed to the the current default to not allow people in. So it's more of a, even though we call it the Open Borders Act, it is more of a loose Borders Act, but the presumption should be that we should have increased immigration. When we discuss immigration, a lot of times we think about it as a democratic platform, that the Democrats are the party of pro-immigration, but there is a substantial right-wing, um, economically motivated sector that believes that it would be intrinsically good for our economy due to the slowing birth rates to allow the free flow of immigration in order to aid the ailing economy, and that our low jobless rates are proof that we just don't have enough workers to fill the type of jobs needed to continue to make our economy strong and have a stronger base, as opposed to, kind of the tax cuts and free flow for the rich that currently exist. So, to end the presentation, there'll be a follow-up video to this where we analyze each piece of evidence in the 1AC. But for now, know that the plan is loose borders that allows for strict scrutiny that errs on the side of liberty to allow immigrants into the country. Your advantages are morality, a prima facie case that says that we should consider that moral claim before any other question, and then allows for second advantage, secondary one, that can solve poverty, structural inequality, as well as the breakdown of the global economic order by increasing our global GDP by trillions, by allowing for the free flow of migration that can fill various jobs across the world. And that is it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and good luck in reading your Open Borders affirmative this year.